The incident on Highway 17. Jason Thompson loved his job as a long-haul truck driver. The open road, the freedom, the quiet nights under a blanket of stars, all of it brought him peace. But on a cool autumn evening, his life would change forever on a stretch of road known as Highway 17. The day started like any other. Jason woke up at dawn, grabbed a quick breakfast at a roadside diner, and hit the road. His delivery route took him through the winding roads of the Appalachian Mountains, a route he had driven many times before. The weather was clear, and Jason was in good spirits as he navigated his rig through the twists and turns. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the road, Jason's radio crackled to life, a warning about an accident ahead. He slowed down, keeping an eye out for any signs of trouble. Sure enough, as he rounded a bend, he saw the flashing lights of police cars and ambulances. Jason pulled over and stepped out of his truck, curious about what had happened. A police officer approached him, her face grim. "Bad wreck up ahead," she said. "We're diverting traffic through the old service road. It's narrow and a bit tricky, but it's the only way around." Jason nodded and climbed back into his truck. He followed the other vehicles as they made their way onto the narrow, gravel-covered service road. The road was barely wide enough for his rig, and he had to go slow to avoid slipping off the edge. As he drove, Jason noticed something odd. There were no other vehicles coming from the opposite direction. It was as if the road was a one-way path into darkness. The trees closed in around him, blocking out the remaining light of the day. Then he saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. Jason slammed on the brakes, bringing his truck to a screeching halt. The figure didn't move. It was a woman, her clothes torn and dirty, her face pale and expressionless. Jason rolled down his window. "Are you okay?" he called out. The woman didn't respond. She just stood there staring at him. Jason felt a chill run down his spine. Something wasn't right. He grabbed his flashlight and climbed out of the truck. "Ma'am, do you need help?" he asked, approaching her slowly. As he got closer, he noticed her eyes. They were empty, lifeless. Jason's heart raced as he reached out to touch her shoulder. His hand passed right through her. He stumbled back, terrified. The woman vanished, leaving nothing but the cold night air. Jason jumped back into his truck, his hands shaking. He fumbled with the keys, finally managing to start the engine. He drove as fast as he could, desperate to get off the service road. The road seemed to stretch on forever, winding deeper into the forest. Jason's headlights cut through the darkness, but all he could see were the trees and the gravel road ahead. He glanced at his fuel gauge. It was getting low. He needed to find a way back to the main highway soon. After what felt like hours, he saw a sign up ahead. "Rest area, 1 mile." Relieved, Jason continued driving. The rest area was small, just a gravel lot with a couple of picnic tables and a restroom. But it was a welcome sight. He pulled in and parked his truck. He needed a break to catch his breath and clear his head. As he sat there, trying to calm down, he heard a noise. A faint, distant scream. He looked around but saw nothing. Jason grabbed his flashlight again and stepped out of the truck. The scream came again, louder this time. It was coming from the woods. Against his better judgment, Jason followed the sound. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the dense underbrush and twisted trees. The scream grew louder, more desperate. "Hello?" Jason called out. "Is anyone there?" No response. He continued walking, his heart pounding in his chest. The scream echoed through the trees, leading him deeper into the forest. Then he saw her. The same woman from the road, standing by a tree. She looked at him with those empty eyes, her mouth open in a silent scream. Jason froze. He wanted to run, to get back to his truck and drive away. But he couldn't move. The woman's gaze held him in place. Suddenly, she pointed behind him. Jason turned slowly, his flashlight illuminating the ground. There, half buried in the dirt, was a car. It was old and rusted, covered in leaves and debris. Inside, he saw the skeletal remains of a person, their bony fingers gripping the steering wheel. Jason's breath caught in his throat. He turned back to the woman, but she was gone. The forest was silent once more. He stumbled back to his truck, his mind racing. What had he just seen? Who was that woman, and what had happened to the person in the car? Jason didn't sleep that night. He stayed in his truck, waiting for the first light of dawn. As soon as it was light enough to see, he drove back to the main highway, not daring to look back. When he finally reached a town, he found a payphone and called the police. He told them about the car and the body in the woods. They promised to investigate. A few days later, Jason received a call from the police. They had found the car and identified the remains. It was a woman who had gone missing years ago. Her car had veered off the service road during a storm, and she had been trapped there ever since. Jason's blood ran cold. The woman he had seen, she had been trying to lead him to her body, to finally be found and put to rest. He never drove that route again. The memory of that night haunted him. The image of the woman's empty eyes and silent scream etched into his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something he had missed. Years passed, but Jason never forgot. He retired from trucking and moved to a small town, hoping to find some peace. But every night as he lay in bed, he could still hear the faint, distant scream echoing through his mind. The affair. David Thompson had it all: a successful career, a beautiful home, and a loving wife named Sarah. They had been married for 10 years, and from the outside, their life looked perfect. But behind closed doors, things were different. The passion had faded, and the daily grind had taken its toll on their relationship. It was during a business trip to New York that David met Emma. She was a colleague from another branch, vibrant and full of life, a stark contrast to the monotony he felt at home. They clicked immediately, and what started as harmless flirting quickly turned into something more. They began meeting after work, sharing drinks and intimate conversations. Before long, they were involved in a full-blown affair. David knew it was wrong, but the excitement and the thrill were too intoxicating to resist. He promised himself it would be a one-time thing, but one night turned into many. He found himself making excuses to visit New York more often, always eager to see Emma. He felt alive again, something he hadn't felt in years. Back home, Sarah started to notice the changes in David. He was distant, often preoccupied, and his frequent business trips made her suspicious. She tried to confront him, but he always had plausible excuses. She wanted to believe him, but a nagging feeling in her gut told her otherwise. One evening, while David was away on yet another trip, Sarah decided to look through his things. She felt guilty invading his privacy, but she needed to know the truth. In his office, she found an old phone he had stopped using. Curiosity got the better of her and she turned it on. What she found shattered her world. There were messages, hundreds of them, between David and a woman named Emma. They were explicit, filled with details of their encounters and declarations of love. Sarah's hands trembled as she read through them, tears streaming down her face. When David returned home, Sarah confronted him. He tried to deny it at first, but the evidence was undeniable. He confessed, begging for forgiveness, but Sarah was too hurt and angry to listen. She threw him out, saying she needed time to think. David moved into a hotel, his mind racing with guilt and regret. He tried calling Emma, but she didn't answer. He felt alone and desperate. He knew he had destroyed his marriage, and now he was losing everything. As the days turned into weeks, David's despair grew. He missed Sarah terribly and realized how much he had taken her for granted. He tried to make amends, sending her flowers, writing her letters, but she remained distant. One night, David received a call from an unknown number. It was Emma. She sounded frantic, her voice shaking. She told him she was being followed, that someone was watching her. David tried to calm her down, but she insisted she wasn't safe. She begged him to come to her apartment. Despite everything, David still cared for Emma. He agreed to go, hoping he could help her and maybe find some solace for himself. He drove to her apartment, his mind filled with worry. When he arrived, the building was eerily quiet. He took the elevator to her floor and knocked on her door. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time, but still, there was no response. He tried the handle, and to his surprise, it was unlocked. David stepped inside, calling out for Emma. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from a flickering TV in the living room. He walked further in, his heart pounding. He found Emma sitting on the couch, her back to him. "Emma?" he called softly. She didn't respond. He moved closer, reaching out to touch her shoulder. As he turned her around, he recoiled in horror. Emma's eyes were wide open, staring lifelessly. Her throat had been slashed and blood soaked her clothes and the couch. David stumbled back, his mind reeling. He needed to call the police. He fumbled for his phone, but before he could dial, he heard a noise behind him. He turned to see a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. "Who are you?" David demanded, his voice shaking. The figure stepped into the light, revealing a man with cold, piercing eyes. "I knew you'd come," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "You ruined everything, now you pay." David tried to run, but the man was faster. He tackled David to the ground and they struggled. David fought desperately, but the man was stronger. He felt a sharp pain as the man plunged a knife into his side. David gasped, his vision blurring. The last thing he saw was the man's face, twisted in rage before everything went dark. Back at home, Sarah received a call from the police the next morning. They informed her of David's death, and she was devastated. Despite everything, she still loved him, and now he was gone. The investigation revealed that the man who killed David and Emma was Emma's ex-boyfriend. He had been stalking her for months, driven mad by jealousy and rage. When he discovered her affair with David, he decided to take his revenge. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. If only she had confronted David sooner, if only she had tried to save their marriage, maybe things would have been different. But now it was too late. David was gone, and she was left with nothing but memories and a broken heart. In the end, the affair that had promised excitement and passion had brought only pain and tragedy. The house that once echoed with laughter now stood silent, a testament to the consequences of betrayal and the high price of infidelity. The Night of Shadows. Megan had always loved her job as a night shift nurse. The quiet of the hospital at night, the soft hum of the machines, and the dimmed lights all created a serene atmosphere that she found oddly comforting. She had been working at St. Mary's Hospital for over 5 years, and nothing had ever felt out of the ordinary, until that night. It was a particularly dark and stormy night, with rain lashing against the windows and thunder rumbling in the distance. Megan was making her rounds, checking on patients and ensuring everything was in order. The hospital felt emptier than usual, with many of the rooms vacant. The storm seemed to have kept most people at home. As she walked down the long, dimly lit corridor of the 3rd floor, she noticed a door at the end of the hall slightly ajar. Room 309. She was sure it had been empty earlier. Megan approached cautiously and pushed the door open. The room was dark, but she could make out a figure lying in the bed. "Hello?" she called softly. "Is everything all right?" There was no response. Megan stepped closer, her heart beginning to race. As she reached the bedside, she saw that the figure was an old man. He lay perfectly still, eyes closed, his chest rising and falling steadily. She checked the chart at the foot of the bed. There was no name, no information, nothing to indicate who he was or how he had gotten there. Suddenly, the man's eyes snapped open and he grabbed Megan's wrist with surprising strength. She gasped and tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. "Help me," he whispered, his voice raspy and weak. "He is coming." Megan's heart pounded in her chest. "Who is coming? What do you mean?" Before he could answer, the man's eyes rolled back in his head and he fell limp. His hand released its grip on her wrist, and he lay motionless once more. Megan quickly checked his pulse. It was faint, but there. She ran to the nurse's station to call for help, but when she returned with Dr. Lawson, the bed was empty. "Are you sure you saw someone?" Dr. Lawson asked, looking skeptical. "Yes, I'm sure," Megan insisted. "He was right here." Dr. Lawson checked the chart and shrugged. "There's no record of anyone being admitted to this room tonight. Maybe you were just tired and imagined it." Megan knew what she had seen, but there was no point in arguing. She spent the rest of the night feeling uneasy, her eyes constantly drifting to the end of the hall where room 309 stood. The storm continued to rage outside, and the hospital seemed to creak and groan with every gust of wind. Around midnight, Megan heard a noise coming from the basement. It sounded like a low, rumbling growl. She hesitated, then decided to investigate. She took the elevator down to the basement, where the hospital stored old medical equipment and supplies. The basement was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of dust and decay. Megan shone her flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness. She saw nothing out of the ordinary, but the growling noise continued, louder now. She followed the sound to a door at the far end of the basement. It was an old, heavy door, one she had never noticed before. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was pitch black and the growling was deafening. Megan felt a chill run down her spine as she shone her flashlight around. The beam caught something moving in the shadows, a dark, hulking figure that seemed to melt into the darkness. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The figure moved closer and she could see glowing red eyes staring at her from the darkness. It growled again, a deep, menacing sound that sent shivers down her spine. Megan turned and ran, slamming the door behind her. She raced up the stairs and back to the safety of the brightly lit hospital corridors. Her heart was pounding, and she could barely catch her breath. She tried to tell Dr. Lawson and the other nurses about what she had seen, but no one believed her. They thought she was tired, overworked, maybe even hallucinating. But Megan knew what she had seen was real. Over the next few nights, strange things began to happen. Lights flickered on and off, equipment malfunctioned, and patients reported seeing shadows moving in their rooms. Megan could feel the presence of something evil lurking in the hospital, watching her, waiting. One night, as she made her rounds, she heard the growling again. It was coming from the 4th floor this time. She followed the sound, her heart racing. The hallways were empty and eerily silent, the only sound the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. As she approached room 409, the growling grew louder. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty, but the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. She shone her flashlight around and her beam caught something moving in the corner. The dark figure stepped out of the shadows, its red eyes glowing menacingly. Megan backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure moved closer, its growling filling the room. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. Megan screamed, banging on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The figure moved closer, its red eyes fixed on her. She could feel its cold breath on her neck, the growling filling her ears. Suddenly, the door burst open and Dr. Lawson and a security guard rushed in. The figure vanished, and the room was empty once more. Megan collapsed, sobbing, into Dr. Lawson's arms. "It's real," she cried. "There's something here. It's after me." Dr. Lawson looked at her with concern. "We need to get you some help, Megan. You're not well." Megan was admitted to the psychiatric ward, where she spent the next few days under observation. She felt trapped, alone, and no one believed her story. She could still feel the presence of the dark figure, lurking just out of sight, waiting for its chance. One night, as she lay in her bed, she heard the growling again. It was louder this time, more insistent. She looked around, but the room was empty. The growling grew louder, and she could feel the figure's presence, closer than ever. Megan knew she had to escape. She couldn't stay in the hospital any longer. She waited until the night shift nurse was distracted, then slipped out of her room and made her way to the stairwell. She could hear the growling behind her, growing louder with every step. She raced down the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. She burst out of the hospital and into the stormy night, the rain lashing against her skin. She ran as fast as she could, but the growling was right behind her, the figure chasing her through the darkness. Megan ran until she couldn't run anymore. She collapsed on the ground, exhausted and terrified. The growling was all around her now, the dark figure closing in. She looked up and saw its glowing red eyes staring down at her, filled with malice. The last thing Megan heard was the sound of her own scream, echoing through the stormy night. The dark figure enveloped her, and she was swallowed by the darkness. The next morning, the hospital staff found Megan's body in the parking lot, her face twisted in terror. There was no sign of the dark figure, no evidence of what had happened. But the growling continued, echoing through the empty halls of St. Mary's Hospital, a reminder of the evil that lurked in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. Good night.